It started with a deep, bone-shaking tremor, a sound that seemed to rise from the center of the earth itself, echoing through the heart of Naples like a warning whispered from the ancient past. On May 13th, 2025, the earth beneath Campi Flegrei stirred with a violence that sent shock waves not just through the ground, but through the hearts of millions. A magnitude 4.4 earthquake hit with terrifying force, waking the sleeping caldera in the shadow of one of the most dangerous supervolcanoes on Earth. And it didn't stop there. In the space of a single day, 49 more tremors followed, a seismic cascade that seemed to defy every model, every assumption, every fragile hope that this ancient beast would remain silent. Within hours, another swarm of 24 quakes shook the region. The earth groaned, streets cracked open, gas lines hissed and split, and a growing sense of dread settled over the people of Naples like ash from an invisible eruption. In that moment, the past and future collided. Italy declared a state of emergency. The world took notice. Scientists who had studied Campi Flegrei for decades found themselves staring at data that shattered their predictions. What was once theoretical became terrifyingly real. The ground wasn't just shifting, it was rising, bulging upward at a pace that no one could ignore. 2 centimeters every month. That's twice the rate from just 6 months earlier. At Rione Terra in Pozzuoli, the earth had already lifted by 143 centimeters, nearly 5 feet. Entire buildings sagged and split apart. Foundations crumbled, walls peeled away from their corners. What had once been quiet residential neighborhoods began to resemble war zones. Roads warped like paper in fire. Emergency vehicles were blocked by twisted asphalt, unable to reach the very people who needed them most. This wasn't just another Brady seismic episode like the ones that passed in the 1950s or 1980s, periods of swelling that eventually settled. No, this time was different, faster, deeper, more chaotic. The deformation wasn't slowing, it was accelerating, and that terrified those who understood what that might mean. Earthquakes that once rumbled deep below now struck at a depth of just 1 or 2 kilometers. That's a whisper away from the surface. It's the thinnest layer of crust ever recorded over Campi Flegrei's magma chamber, and the signs were everywhere if you knew how to read them. Volcanologists from the INGV, the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, reported something chilling. Gases leaking from fumaroles now bore unmistakable magmatic fingerprints. Sulfur dioxide levels had surged 5-fold since January. The smell of brimstone wasn't just poetic metaphor anymore, it was a chemical scream. Monitoring wells registered temperature spikes over 15 degrees Celsius in a matter of weeks. And then came the worst sign of all, volcanic tremor. It's a low, rhythmic rumble beneath the surface, a kind of seismic heartbeat that only pulses when magma is on the move. It had never been recorded at Campi Flegrei outside of an eruption. Until now. The magma, they believe, is rising. What makes this unfolding crisis even more unsettling is the way it mirrors volcanic systems just before they erupt. Deep below the surface, fresh magma appears to be carving new paths, sidestepping the old clogged conduits that once blocked it. Satellite thermal imagery captured hotspots where there had been none, new zones of intense heat glowing like embers beneath the caldera. Groundwater chemistry began to shift, spiking with elements like fluorine and arsenic, dead giveaways that magma was entering the aquifer. These weren't slow geological processes unfolding over years. They were happening now, week by week, changing the face of southern Italy in real time. And still, the official warning level remained at yellow, a symbol of caution, not panic. But look closer, and a darker reality emerged. Behind closed doors, Italy's Civil Protection Agency was acting with increasing urgency. Military trucks rolled through Pozzuoli at night. Helicopters practiced extractions. Hospitals rehearsed evacuations not once a year, but every week. Emergency response centers that used to shut down at night now stayed open around the clock. Thousands of cots and emergency shelters were requisitioned, though the public hadn't been told why. Scientists, meanwhile, struggled with an ethical burden no one should have to carry: how much to share and when. Beneath the streets of Naples, something vast and ancient was stirring. Seismic tomography, a kind of 3D ultrasound of the Earth, revealed a shocking truth just last week. A huge new zone of partially molten rock had formed, stretching more than 4 kilometers across. It wasn't there 6 months ago, and it wasn't some minor tremor-induced anomaly. It was a magma reservoir large enough to fill 200,000 Olympic swimming pools, pressing upward, shifting the weight of the entire caldera. High-precision gravity readings confirmed it. A 500,000,000 cubic meters of new magma had risen into the system. Even as officials reassured the public, the data painted a starker picture. The very tools designed to warn us of danger, our volcano alert systems, were built decades ago, long before the ultra-sensitive instruments we use today could measure the ground's every twitch, every breath. That mismatch created a dangerous balance between what scientists could see and what the public was told. In a confidential session just days ago, the European Volcano Observatory Crisis Committee voted to recommend full evacuation planning. The vote passed 11-2, yet the recommendation remained political calculation, and the unbearable weight of knowing that acting too soon might cause panic, but acting too late might cost everything. Outwardly, people went to work, children played, but beneath their feet the crust itself was stretching, tearing at the seams. Advanced satellite imagery confirmed it. The caldera was not only swelling, it was thinning, elongating, showing signs of imminent structural failure. Earthquake wave patterns told another story. The rock was no longer bending, it was breaking. And once rock breaks, magma doesn't ask permission to follow. Gas readings became even more disturbing. Carbon dioxide, colorless and odorless, but deadly, began pooling in low-lying areas. The flux had increased 17-fold in just 5 months. Hidden valleys of invisible death formed in basements and alleyways. Hydrogen and carbon ratios in volcanic gases flipped. Another harrowing signal. The last time that was seen was just before the eruptions of Pinatubo and Rabaul, two of the most devastating volcanic events of the 20th century. And then came the question no one wanted to answer. What would trigger a full evacuation? What number, what sign, what shift in sulfur or seismicity would be enough to say, it's time to run? For now, no one knows. The days following the initial earthquake swarm felt like something torn from the pages of a dystopian novel. In the narrow, cobbled streets of Pozzuoli, where children once played and neighbors gathered under awnings to drink espresso, a palpable tension had begun to spread like fog. It wasn't just the cracks splitting through ancient stone walls or the jarring groan of shifting earth underfoot. It was the sense that something immense, something ancient and patient, had finally stirred from its slumber. At first there was confusion. Families clung to the illusion of normalcy, hoping the shaking would stop, that this would be another false alarm like those of decades past. But the tremors didn't stop. They came in waves, short, sharp bursts, each one shallower than the last, each one driving the magma closer to the fragile surface of the caldera. What was once considered deep rumbling had shifted into something more sinister. Volcanic tremor. The signature of magma moving like blood beneath skin stretched too thin. Scientists at the Italian National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, INGV, rushed to recalibrate models, to update forecasts, to make sense of the madness. But the numbers betrayed them. Ground deformation was no longer uniform. Instead of a gentle dome rising steadily over time, satellite data showed an asymmetric bulge forming near Solfatara and Pozzuoli. The Earth wasn't just rising, it was warping, twisting under the pressure of fresh magma carving a new path. These weren't just geological anomalies. They were the signs of a living, breathing force preparing to erupt. And yet the official alert level remained stagnant at yellow. It was a color meant to suggest caution, not panic. But inside the locked offices of emergency management, the conversations turned darker. There were arguments, silent votes, whispers of evacuation. While the public was reassured, the military moved in the shadows. Hospitals were ordered to run drills weekly instead of annually. Shelters were stocked quietly. Firefighters and police were given evacuation protocols not yet shared with the communities they served. Italy's Civil Protection Department requisitioned buses and fuel reserves. And still, no red alert, no public alarm. Even as the cracks in the pavement widened and the temperature in underground wells soared, the silence held. Gas emissions surged, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, fluorine, arsenic, all whispering the same story. Magma was closer than ever. Invisible death valleys formed, pockets where CO2 gathered in lethal concentrations, silent and scentless, heavy as nightfall. Locals noticed animals behaving strangely. Birds fled, dogs whined without reason, and still officials downplayed the danger. Inside the NGV labs, data scientists and geophysicists reviewed the new imaging. The seismic tomography was clear. There was a vast zone of partial melt forming just beneath the surface, stretching laterally for kilometers. It hadn't been there 6 months ago. This wasn't just a flare-up. This was a transformation. Gravity surveys revealed an astonishing figure. 0.5 billion cubic meters of magma had shifted, enough to bury a city. Thermal imaging captured new hotspots blooming across the caldera floor like malignant growths. At the microscopic level, the earthquakes showed brittle failure, not plastic bending. That meant the rock was fracturing, breaking, and those fractures would soon become tunnels for fire. The scientists knew what this meant. Many had seen the same patterns before, on graphs, in textbooks, in the warnings that came too late for Pinatubo, for Ontake, for St. Helens. Campi Flegrei was no longer behaving like a dormant caldera. It was following the script of a volcano on the verge of release. Inside emergency sessions of the European Volcano Observatory Crisis Coordination Committee, recommendations were put forward. Begin evacuation drills, prepare transport corridors, mobilize shelters. But for every voice raised in favor of action, there were others who cautioned restraint. The cost would be astronomical. Naples relied on tourism, on trade, on daily movement that would grind to a halt the moment the alert turned red. A false alarm could bankrupt the city, but a delay could kill it. The emotional weight of these meetings broke some of the researchers. They'd trained their whole lives for this, studying quiet quakes and dormant craters. But now the data was no longer theoretical. It was a warning, a plea, and a few whispered. Back on the streets of Naples, life continued with a strange, forced normality. Churches still held mass. Cafes still opened. Children went to school. But every soul could feel the unease hanging in the air. They could hear the distant booms of underground stress releasing. They could feel the ground, ever so slightly, breathing beneath their feet. Some began to leave, quietly, cautiously. Those with family in the countryside took sudden vacations. Hotels saw abrupt cancellations. Locals whispered to one another in the markets, wondering if the government knew more than it was letting on. They were right to wonder. The models now showed what few wanted to admit. There wasn't enough time. If Campi Flegrei were to erupt with the force scientists now feared, the evacuation would need to begin immediately, not in days, not in hours. Now, because the math was unforgiving, over 500,000 people lived in the red zone, areas expected to be obliterated in the opening moments of an eruption. Even with flawless coordination, the sheer logistics of moving that many people would take at least 72 hours. The roads could not bear the traffic. The railways could not carry the load. The city's infrastructure, beautiful but ancient, was its own trap. In simulations, gridlock choked evacuation routes within 30 minutes. The highways jammed in 90. Hospitals, 7 major ones, all in the potential blast zone, could not move their most vulnerable patients fast enough. There were not enough medical vehicles, not enough fuel, not enough places to go, and the volcano would not wait. Outside Italy, the world began to pay attention. Ash dispersal simulations showed that even a mid-sized eruption would blanket southern Europe in soot within days. Flights would be canceled. Ports shut, crops destroyed. The World Health Organization deployed respiratory aid. NASA redirected satellites to monitor Naples. The global climate models showed a half degree of cooling from the ash, enough to disturb seasonal weather for years. Inside data centers, artificial intelligence systems trained on historical eruption data began to flash red. Pattern recognition algorithms found the same tremor frequencies that had once gone unnoticed before Ontake exploded. Infrasound monitors, designed for nuclear detection, picked up low, rhythmic pulses from Campi Flegrei, the kind that no tectonic quake ever made. The signs were undeniable. Still, no red alert. This was the paradox. The scientists knew. The systems screamed for action. But the machinery of government, burdened by economics, reputation, and fear of overreaction, moved slower than the magma rising beneath their feet. And so the people of Naples stood on the edge of an ancient crater, their lives tethered to the whims of stone and fire and silence. The sky remained blue. The breeze still carried the scent of the sea. But underfoot, the earth whispered a different story, one of urgency, of inevitability, of a reckoning that had waited millennia to arrive. It started with a sound no one expected. Not a roar, not a boom, but a hum. Low, deep, and steady, like a cello string plucked by the earth itself. It vibrated through the walls of homes, through the soles of shoes, through the bones of those who had grown used to the distant groans of the caldera. But this was different. This was alive. Impunctually, some rushed to windows, others froze mid-step. In Naples, the larger buildings began to sway ever so slightly, like reeds bowing to an unseen breath. Cell phones lit up all at once. The civil protection alert system had triggered at last. But it wasn't the red alert people had long feared. It was a message to remain calm, to seek shelter, to wait for further instructions. But the instructions never came, because in that moment, at 5:47 a.m., the crust cracked. A white-hot pillar of gas burst from the heart of Solfatara like a fist through fabric. It wasn't ash yet, just steam, scalding, sulfurous, rising faster than wind. Birds dropped mid-flight. The thermal cameras watching from satellites captured the bloom in real time. A sudden spike of temperature, then a flash. The explosion that followed was deafening. It shattered windows 20 kilometers away. It ruptured eardrums. It sent shockwaves rippling across the Bay of Naples, like thunder beneath water. The eruption had begun. Within seconds, columns of ash and pumice began clawing their way skyward, twisting into the stratosphere. Lightning crackled through the black tower of volcanic debris, each strike a strobe flash of raw chaos. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas, ash, and shattered rock raced outward from the breach at hundreds of kilometers per hour. There was no time to flee. No one outran them. They filled valleys, crossed roads, flattened structures with the force of 1,000 hammers. Entire neighborhoods vanished in minutes. The ancient streets of Pozzuoli, those cobbled paths that had outlived empires, were drowned in fire. Even those who had left early found themselves trapped in the gridlock of fleeing thousands. Cars became ovens. Tunnels became tombs. The Marischiaro cliffs cracked and collapsed into the sea, sending waves crashing into the waterfront. Boats in the harbor were tossed like toys. The sky darkened as ash began to fall like snow, warm, gray, suffocating. Naples itself reeled. While not in the immediate kill zone, the city was choked by ash and panic. Power grids failed. Streetlights flickered out. Hospitals were overwhelmed within the hour. People coughing, burned, lost in the chaos. The train stations became shelters, then prisons. Communications jammed. The mayor declared martial law, but by then, the city had already begun to collapse inward. The weight of centuries was caving in on itself. And still, the volcano grew louder. A second vent opened near the Agnano crater, throwing fountains of lava into the air. From space, the eruption resembled a detonation, a series of expanding shockwaves spiraling outward in rings of destruction. The ash plume had reached the upper atmosphere now, over 30 kilometers high, punching a hole through the troposphere. It drifted eastward toward the Balkans, then looped around into Central Europe, carried by the jet stream. Airports in Rome, Athens, Vienna, Munich, all grounded. Agriculture halted. But the worst was still beneath the surface. Beneath the caldera, a massive chamber of partially melted rock had become destabilized. The eruption had breached only a fraction of it. The rest was still pressurized, straining at the seams of the fractured earth. Seismometers recorded harmonic tremor that echoed like a scream without end. The earth convulsed. A third vent opened, then a fourth. By the end of the first day, Campi Flegrei had transformed into a chain of eruptive mounds, a gaping, fiery wound stretching from Solfatara to Monte Nuovo, a line of destruction that mirrored the old caldera boundary, as if the land itself remembered its past and was rewriting it with fire. Satellite images from ESA and NASA painted a grim portrait. Nearly 12 square kilometers were already buried under pyroclastic material. Over 150,000 people were feared dead or missing, many simply vaporized. Those who survived the initial blast were now facing starvation, dehydration, or hypothermia under the volcanic winter that had begun to descend. The global impact was immediate. Stock markets shuddered, energy prices spiked, crops failed across southern Europe within weeks due to blocked sunlight. Acid rain poured over Greece, Albania, and Croatia. Rivers turned toxic. Fish floated to the surface in brackish, heated water. In Germany, asthma rates doubled within days. In France, the skies turned gray, then ochre. In Morocco, the winds brought ash to the edge of the Sahara. In New York and Tokyo, people watched the images on screens, unable to look away. They saw the streets of Naples reduced to dust and silence. They saw an entire civilization brought to its knees by an invisible countdown that had ticked down for thousands of years, unheard and unheeded. Then came the second wave. 3 days into the eruption, the ground beneath the Tyrrhenian Sea to the west of Naples began to buckle. Magma had infiltrated the offshore faults. A new rift was opening. Seismic stations detected deep tremors beneath the seafloor. Then in the early morning hours, the worst-case scenario arrived. A submarine landslide triggered by the destabilized slope of the seabed. The displacement sent a tsunami roaring toward the Italian coastline. It wasn't large enough to cross the ocean, but it didn't need to be. Naples, already crippled, was now drowned. Those who had clung to rooftops or terraces were swept away. The harbor became a maelstrom. Oil storage tanks exploded. Fires met water in terrible equilibrium. By the end of the first week, the Campi Flegrei eruption had become the deadliest volcanic event in modern history. Over 300,000 casualties, millions displaced, southern Italy rendered uninhabitable. A year without summer was now forecast. The World Food Program declared an agricultural emergency. Governments across Europe opened their borders to Italian refugees. But it wasn't enough. From Reykjavik to Cairo, the world watched the aftermath, stunned. But within the scientific community, another emotion dominated. Guilt. They had seen it coming. The data had been clear. The signs had shouted. But politics, economics, fear of panic, they had dulled the edge of science. They had delayed action. And in that delay, hundreds of thousands had died. And then the hardest truth of all emerged. Campi Flegrei wasn't finished. Like a breathing lung, it had exhaled. But deep beneath the crust, the caldera was refilling. Pressure was already rebuilding. The magma chamber, though depleted, was not empty. It never had been. Campi Flegrei wasn't a singular event. It was a cycle, a breath, a pause. And one day, another eruption. The survivors would rebuild, of course. They always had. Humanity is stubborn that way. But the shadow cast by Campi Flegrei would never vanish. It would stretch across maps and memories, a permanent reminder that beneath even the most ancient, beautiful cities, there are titans waiting to wake. And when they do, they don't whisper. They roar.